Hello, my name is Dijana Espinoza. Thank you so much for viewing my presentation. This presentation is an analysis of the instances of family violence in rural settings. This is a brief overview of the topics that will be addressed. For the theoretical framework, I chose feminist theory. Although there are several theories that do apply to this topic, I went with feminist theory. Not to say that women are the only people who experience family violence, because that is certainly not the case, but because the focus of feminist theory is on vulnerable populations, also populations who struggle with achieving power and also having power used to control them, oppression, and politics or policy, which are all things that affect those who experience family violence either as a victim or as a perpetrator. There is an intersectionality of family violence. There are many different levels. Domestic violence is one, and that is violence against anybody within a family, could be siblings or simply those who just live together. Intimate partner violence is specifically for couples, those who are in an intimate or romantic relationship. There's also child abuse and sexual abuse. And it has been shown that often where one of these levels of abuse is present, there is often one or more also present. Due to the intersectionality of family violence, different agencies often address different issues. Agency collaboration is something that is very important, and it is in the best interest of the client due to the fact that oftentimes where there is one level of abuse, there is others. In urban settings, it is very common and a lot easier for these agencies to collaborate on these issues, but due to the isolation and the limited availability of resources and agencies in rural communities, they struggle with agency collaboration. So, to address resource availability, again, there is a high level of isolation in rural communities. So, it is very long distances in between agencies and in between agencies and clients, and also they're very limited. Childcare is another resource that is difficult to access in rural communities because of the isolation and the low populations. There's often very few commercial childcare providers. Children are often left with family or friends or unofficial childcare providers, and unfortunately, this often leads to child abuse and sexual abuse in rural communities. Anonymity is something that they struggle with in rural communities, because again of the close tight-knit community. It is difficult for those trying to access resources to remain anonymous. If a victim of abuse wants to call the police, it is not uncommon for the police to know the abuser and also know the family. And then, with it being such a small town, if somebody were to go to an agency to obtain services and somebody sees their vehicle outside the building, now the whole town knows that they are trying to access resources. And in rural communities, there is a high level of stigma with accessing resources, which hinders victims and perpetrators from accessing resources because of the stigma related to it. Reporting is also something that is a struggle in the rural community because of the inability to remain anonymous and because of the stigma. Statistics on family violence in rural communities are somewhat unreliable due to the lack of reporting that is, again, unique to the rural setting. Social capital is something that is much more prevalent in rural communities than urban communities, although it is present in urban communities. The culture of rural society does have more defined societal roles and expectations. Therefore, it is very common for women to be mostly associated with religious activities education, healthcare, community events, whereas the men are more associated with business, agriculture, and politics. And this exchange of social capital is beneficial not only to the individual, but also to the community as a whole. When somebody is experiencing family abuse, it affects their ability to participate in that exchange of social capital. And this has a strong negative effect on the mental and physical health of the individual. And again, this is for both men and women. When they are no longer to participate and invest in their community, it has a negative effect in rural settings. In regards to policies and programs, I did not have an easy time finding policies specific to rural communities. They do mainly follow the national and state and local policies that are already in place, but they do have a strong effort of implementing programs. I found information on domestic violence shelters in rural communities that have had very positive impacts on the individuals and the communities as well. There have also been school programs, not just for the students and the children who are experiencing family abuse at home, but also for educators and faculties to teach them how to recognize the signs of family abuse and also to support those who may be experiencing it. And again, because children who experience abuse in the home often turn it on their peers and their partners, there are some programs for adolescents in school and also counseling and group therapy programs to help them overcome the effects of experiencing violence in their home. I did find some slight information about policies for gun confiscation in rural communities. Because the instances of family violence are much more prevalent in rural communities, they are also much more severe. And also, gun ownership also is much more prevalent in rural communities due to the activities of hunting and agriculture. They are more likely to have guns in the home and also a different type of guns. Those in rural communities more often have things like rifles and shotguns, which don't always have to be registered. And so nationally, whenever somebody is charged with perpetuating domestic violence, they are no longer allowed to legally own a gun. But because of the types of guns and because of the rural culture, those in rural communities often have an easier time holding on to their guns, and that is something they are trying to tighten up on. Because, again, as you can see in the graph, instances of family violence in rural communities are much more prevalent and they are also much more severe. This graph shows the instances of intimate partner violence in the United States overall and then broken down into sections. And you can see in almost every area, the rural community has a much higher prevalence. As far as implications for practice, agency collaboration would be a great benefit to the rural community, but in order to do that, more agencies need to be present. Um, Reporting is something that needs to be addressed in rural community. The stigma of reporting is improving, but does still have a long way to go. And also the ability to remain anonymous is something that needs to be addressed to increase reporting in rural communities. And again, there is a reason why family violence is so much more prevalent and so much more severe in rural communities, and that is something that needs to be addressed about what it is unique about rural communities that makes it so much more intense. And once that is addressed, it needs to be a focus on reducing the prevalence of family violence in rural communities. And that is my presentation. Thank you so much for watching.